Okay, so moving on to week 3. As I mentioned, this week we really are going to focus a little more directly on self-reflexivity, even though we started to touch on it as we looked at solutions and processes to cope with culture shock. I think self-reflexivity is, I actually think it's the number one learning tool towards dealing with culture shock and in intercultural training in general. I love the Craig Engstrom article on autoethnography. I am basically equating what I'm calling self-reflexivity with what he's calling autoethnography. It's the same process from my point of view. And I think he just nails it when he describes his experiences with culture shock and repatriation, and how, had he gone through autoethnography or self-reflexivity, he would have been more prepared to handle that. So love, love, love this article. When I read it, I was like, yes, this is exactly what I'm talking about. And it's the best article I've found on the subject. And so until I write something else on self-reflexivity, it's my favorite article. Although I think even if I wrote something else, it would still be my favorite article because I don't think I'd top it. Anyway, so we're looking at self-reflexivity, and there's sort of two components that I see in going through this process. One is, as I've said before, and I'll say it again, understanding your own cultural starting points, understanding your own socialization process so that you can begin to view your cultural identities within the context of other cultural identities. It moves us away from seeing things as right and wrong. It helps us have insight and empathy into how others are raised and socialized to understand, again, them as cultural beings, us as cultural beings, and kind of negotiating that a little more intentionally. The other piece of it that kind of stems out of this self-reflexive look, or this looking at our own cultural starting points, is starting to recognize and examining larger cultural systems and how they work and how we participate in them every day, and the way that we kind of are able to see those systems is by sort of dismantling what's happening there and moving far enough back to say, well, why does this happen this way? It's not because it's the right way to do things, it's because of this cultural belief that we all have that this is right. So I think I've talked a little bit before about the healthcare system, which is one of my favorites, but I could even go into the legal system. And we can look at different justice systems that are very cultural, and we can say, well, clearly the US American culture values this idea, which I think is a myth, of objectivity. So whatever we can take away, we try to detract or, what's the word? Pull out any emotions that are involved in these things, like the legal system or the healthcare system. We're not emotions are not a part of it. I suppose we could look at psychology and say, yes, emotions are a part of that system. But it's almost this attempt to sterilize things, to be able to view them black and white within the legal system and within the health system. And again, we can start dismantling those systems and say, well, you know, Native American cultures handle the justice system and telling people stories and understanding them and having their own family decide what is the best punishment or correction for that person is highly valued, because how can strangers decide what's best for this person? So looking at those as cultural and realizing the part we play into them, the belief systems that they're based on, is really important. And part of the reason that it is important is because when you go to another culture, it allows you to kind of suspend judgment and say, well, I know that I come from a culture with all these systems in place that are based on our cultural beliefs. I can start to examine the systems in this place and see how they're cultural and how they're built. It can give me a deeper understanding. It can ease some of that confusion that we might have around what's going on, why I don't understand how this works. It helps us also to kind of fit pieces together. We can get a general sense about relationships between men and women, for example, are different culturally. So understanding what that plays, and then I as a woman, how do I come into this new system? Understanding that I might feel marginalized in this new system or feel very uncomfortable in the way because I'm coming from my own system. Being able to move in there and negotiate my way and work my way through and not feel quite as marginalized because I understand the cultural systems that I'm coming from and I'm choosing to participate in or not participate in. I can make that choice and understand what's going on and making it. So that is why for our discussion this week, I have you dismantling some systems, which I'm very excited about this discussion. I hope you'll really get in there and start digging out the cultural aspects of some of our systems, and I would encourage all of you to really dig into each other's reflections, not in any sort of negative way necessarily, but just to ask some critical questions. I think sometimes some of our discussion threads kind of die where they might have gone someplace interesting just because we're like, oh, that was a nice story, and how interesting. Let's try to really stretch ourselves and say, that's interesting. Did you ever think about this perspective? Or I had this same experience, but I'm wondering about this. So I'll kind of manage that as well, and if I see opportunities to jump in with a new question, please pay attention to where I'm jumping in, because that's where I'm trying to prompt the discussion to get a little more detailed, a little more specific, and a little more critical perhaps, and I'll try to be upfront about what I'm trying to do or how I'm trying to steer us, so we all know. Let's see here. Again, as I said in the very beginning of the lecture notes, since so many of you have so much experience interculturally, I really would love for us to really start focusing on the training implications for these things, and not just the concepts themselves. So I'm trying to push us ahead a little bit further, and one thing I'll be asking you is, along with some of the things we're doing, and we go through an exercise this week, I believe I'm going to have you work in small groups to go through your cultural metaphors. And again, this is another place where I want you to jump in, and I give a pretty broad lengthy description of what I want you to do with that, but really dig into those metaphors and find out what's going on and make some guesses, make some predictions or hypotheses about what you see happening. And it doesn't have to be right or wrong, because there is no right or wrong with examining and kind of dismantling these metaphors or stories. So that will actually be a training technique. If I had you all in a classroom, we would be breaking into small group discussions, and I'd be facilitating that conversation. And again, we're doing it online, so it's a little different, but I want you to think about that. Think about how you would do it in person. Think about how you might do it differently online if you have ideas there too. And I think another thing that will come out is other ideas that you have. What are other areas for discussion? What are other methods that you could use with your learners to help them move through this process of self-reflexivity? What are the options there? I realize that a lot of you don't have experience doing this before, but I feel like at this point in time, we can be pretty creative about, okay, if I was preparing and I wanted to go through self-reflexivity and I understand what this process is, what do I do in a classroom or outside the classroom? What is the best way to encourage learners to move on? Even thinking through things like, do I need to explain this process first? Do people need to understand what they're going to go through and then go through it? Or is it something that you kind of move them into and let them have those aha moments as you go? I tend to lean as someone who teaches adult learners toward letting people know exactly what you're going to teach them or the process you're going to try to lead them through before you do it. But I've certainly used those aha moments in some different exercises or some different training modules to get people there, to allow them to kind of better understand. Sometimes you can't really explain the process of self-reflexivity as well as you need to, so you need to kind of give people a taste of what that will be like, lead them through an exercise that has them look at their own cultural identity, and give them a taste of what that process will look like and be like, so that they can then make a choice that, yes, I do want to, or that's enough for me, I don't need to examine any more cultural identities, which some people may do, but again, I think learners have to be willing to learn if you're going to teach them something. So we will be transparent with our learning as much as we can.